Hello everyone, tonight we're stepping quietly into a world where patience meant survival and silence was louder than any prayer. A world where a single cracked twig could ruin your dinner and possibly your reputation for the next 3 winters. From hunters who could read footprints like sentences to women who turned bison into clothing, shelter, and soup in a single afternoon, this was life lived with precision, humility, and the occasional mosquito-induced breakdown. Imagine lying perfectly still for hours in freezing mud, whispering apologies to a deer you hadn't even met yet, and being genuinely worried that the wind might think you're arrogant. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy learning how humanity used to function before we needed Wi-Fi to feel alive. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I like knowing who else is awake, listening to history whisper. Now, lower the lights a little. Maybe grab a blanket or some tea. Let the noise outside fade for a while, and together, let's slip back into a quieter world, one where movement was art. The earth was a teacher, and being human required the discipline of a predator who knew how to prey. If you were born into a hunting camp on the northern plains or deep within the pines of the Great Lakes, congratulations, your first toy was probably a bone. Not a polished store-bought kind of bone either, but something your father once threw at a deer. From the beginning, your life was made of what the land offered, and the land was not exactly gentle. Babies were swaddled in hides that smelled faintly of smoke and tallow, rocked to sleep by the rhythm of the wind against a hide tent. Before you could crawl, you were already learning the rules of silence, because the bison don't care that you're teething. In many native nations, childhood was an apprenticeship in observation. The world was a classroom, and your teachers were the trees, the tracks, and the quiet gestures of adults who didn't bother explaining twice. People didn't shout instructions over the prairie. They expected you to watch how a man's breath slowed before he loosed an arrow, or how a woman pressed her hand to the soil to feel the vibration of a distant herd. Speech, frankly, was overrated. Patience wasn't a virtue, it was survival. The average hunter didn't learn by lecture. He learned because his stomach, and everyone else's, depended on it. The first step in that education wasn't how to shoot, it was how to see. You'd spend hours watching your elders trace the soft dents left by hooves in wet earth, or the faint curve of bent grass that meant something alive had passed by. You'd learn to tell direction from the taste of wind and season from the sound of birds arguing in the distance. And when you thought you'd figured it all out, the old man beside you would shake his head slowly and say nothing, which meant you hadn't. This world didn't offer childhood as a long rehearsal for adulthood. It simply handed you a smaller role in the same play. When the adults moved camp, you carried wood. When they set traps, you set smaller ones. It wasn't cruelty. It was continuity. And the measure of your worth wasn't obedience, but awareness. The best hunter was not the one who ran fastest, but the one who noticed everything. The direction of smoke, the silence before a storm, the one bird that suddenly stopped singing because it had sensed you breathing. Every gesture meant something. A father handing his son an arrow shaft wasn't just giving a tool, he was handing down a lineage. Hunters weren't trained as individuals. They were cultivated as extensions of the land. The knowledge of how to track, stalk, and kill gracefully was passed like a song repeated so many times that it became muscle memory, not philosophy. And there was humor in it too, dry as sun-baked mud. An old hunter might whisper to his apprentice, "The deer already knows you're here. He's just letting you think otherwise." Because humility was part of the education. The animals weren't enemies, they were neighbors with better reflexes. You could take one life, maybe 2, but never without ceremony, never without a quiet apology to the wind. The hunter's pride was balanced by superstition. Boast too loudly, and the next arrow would fly crooked, just to keep the gods entertained. So the child grew up surrounded by both tenderness and tension, laughter around the fire, and silence in the fields. Life began not with a cry, but with a whisper, and that whisper echoed through every step that followed. For the hunter, the world was never still. It just waited to see who could listen long enough to move with it. Education, for the young hunter, came with no chalkboards and absolutely no patience for noise. If you spoke too much, someone would hand you a basket of fish guts to keep you occupied. The lesson was simple. Words scared animals, and so did ego. Among the Lakota, the Cree, the the Ojibwe, and countless others. The art of hunting began in silence, the kind that wasn't empty, but alive, layered, humming with everything you weren't saying. Observation was the school of survival. You'd follow the men at dawn, your breath freezing in front of you, and learn by their shadows. Nobody explained why the wind mattered. You found out when your first arrow missed, and every bird within a mile laughed at you by taking off at once. Silence taught faster than speech ever could. Talking about patience was unnecessary when the entire forest demanded it. Children learned through mimicry, not correction. You watched the way an elder bent his knees before stepping, rolling the foot softly so the ground barely noticed him. You memorized how they paused mid-step, like dancers waiting for the drumbeat of wind. If you tripped, no one shouted. They simply kept walking, forcing you to listen harder next time. Silence wasn't just discipline, it was trust. They believed the land itself would teach you, if you shut up long enough to hear it. Around the camp, instruction continued without words. A boy might be handed a broken arrow and told nothing, expected to repair it by watching how the sinew stretched, how the feather was angled to keep the flight true. Girls, too, watched their mothers clean hides or grind pigment, learning the same precision, the same stillness. Every gesture was an encyclopedia entry you could only read through repetition. Even stories, those precious vessels of memory, were told sparingly. The old ones spoke around the fire, but rarely to explain. They recited origin tales, trickster myths, and hunting legends, so full of metaphor that you could spend a lifetime decoding them. The point wasn't to hand you answers, it was to train your mind to notice patterns. When they told of a coyote outsmarting a bear, they weren't teaching animal gossip. They were hinting at the kind of awareness you'd need when the prairie turned dangerous. And there was humor, always. The kind that stings and teaches at the same time. You walk like a white-tailed deer, an elder might tease, meaning you make too much noise for your own good. Or, you aim like a gossiping grandmother, which needed no translation. Mockery was affection. It meant someone cared enough to want you alive next winter. Silence also protected you from arrogance. The best hunters were those who never bragged. If a man came back boasting, others would only nod quietly, because the next day he might come back empty-handed. The forest disliked vanity, and so did the people who depended on it. A loud mouth meant a hungry camp. Learning in that world wasn't about achievement, it was about attunement. Every step, every pause, every shift of light on snow was part of the curriculum. You learned to match your breathing to the wind, to let your heart beat slow until the world forgot you existed. By the time you could notch an arrow, you'd already learned the greater art to disappear so completely that only your shadow hunted. And when that lesson sank in, when silence felt less like absence and more like understanding, the next stage of the education began, learning that every hunt was also a prayer. Every hunt began long before the arrow flew. It started with a kind of etiquette, one that made modern ethics look like a toddler's rulebook. Among hunters across the plains, the woodlands, and the tundra, killing wasn't about dominance, it was negotiation. You didn't take life, you requested it. And sometimes, the answer was no. The Lakota called it wawaha, tognikit, generosity of spirit, the idea that every creature gave itself for balance, not for your convenience. Among the Ojibwe, a hunter might whisper an apology to the deer before skinning it, sometimes sprinkling tobacco or sage nearby as a way of returning the favor. It wasn't guilt, it was acknowledgement, a transaction written in breath rather than ink. To break that code was dangerous, not just socially but cosmically. Kill out of anger or greed, and the animals simply stopped showing themselves. Hunters would say the deer had gone to council, meaning the forest was punishing arrogance. And when the forest punished, it did so quietly. A bowstring would snap, or your aim would falter at the exact moment you needed it most. A superstition, sure, but one backed by centuries of empirical disappointment. Humility was therefore a practical tool. Hunters often avoided speaking of success. The best one in the group might return from a day's hunt, with blood on his hands and a blank face, saying only, "The land was kind today." Everyone knew what that meant. Nobody clapped, they just helped butcher the meat. Boasting would be like shouting during a prayer, rude, and probably cursed. The ceremonies that surrounded the kill were equally meticulous. Some nations would place the bones of a bear in a special pattern facing east, believing its spirit would find the way home. Among the Inuit, every part of the seal was used, skin for rope, oil for lamps, bones for tools. Waste wasn't just frowned upon, it was an invitation for starvation. The universe, it seemed, kept receipts, and so the hunter walked a fine line between reverence and efficiency. He knew the animals' habits intimately, how elk rub against trees to shed velvet, how buffalo circle their young, how rabbits freeze when the wind changes. But he also knew his own mind could betray him. Impatience led to suffering, carelessness led to imbalance. So before the hunt, men might purify themselves in a sweat lodge, scrubbing away not dirt but ego, until their thoughts ran as clear as river water. Every tribe had its own stories about what happened when someone forgot this moral code. The Cheyenne spoke of a man who killed more buffalo than his people could eat. Soon after, his arrows refused to fly straight, and he starved surrounded by bones. Whether literal or not, the message was the same: take too much, and the land takes you back. What modern hunters might call instinct was, in truth, moral alignment. The good hunter's aim came not from skill but from relationship, a kind of unspoken agreement that if he moved gently, the world would feed him. Patience, restraint, and gratitude weren't lofty ideals, they were survival strategies, and from that quiet morality came the objects of the trade, tools carved, not just from materials, but from meaning itself. A hunter's tools weren't manufactured, they were raised. Every arrow, knife, or snare had a lineage born from wood, stone, and tendon, and shaped by patience that bordered on monastic. The bow, for example, wasn't just carved, it was negotiated. Plains hunters sought out osage, orange, wood, or hickory, materials that grew stubborn and dense, perfect for bending without breaking. The wood had to dry for months, sometimes a year. Anything rushed would warp a small, humiliating lesson in how the land punished impatience long before the hunt even began. The arrowheads were flaked from flint, obsidian, or chert with a precision that could make a modern surgeon jealous. One careless strike, and the whole point shattered. A master flintknapper could read the stone's grain like scripture, sending vibrations through it with the exact rhythm needed to birth a perfect edge. And yes, birth was the right word. Each piece took time, breath, and small amounts of blood, because sooner or later, you'd cut yourself, and the stone would get its tribute early. Nothing about these tools was disposable. The bowstring might be twisted from sinew, the tendon of a deer or elk, dried and pulled until it hummed. The feathers on arrows were chosen carefully, turkey for stability, eagle for ceremony, owl for silence. Each had a personality, a temperament. A hunter knew which arrow would fly truest, not by its shape, but by its feel in the hand, the weight between finger and thumb. There was an intimacy to it all. You didn't just own your tools, you lived with them. They hung beside you in the lodge, repaired at night under the dim smoke of the fire, rubbed with grease to keep them from drying out. A good bow aged with its maker. When it finally cracked, it was burned, not discarded, because even dead, it was still considered alive. Of course, each region's hunters worked with what the landscape offered. Woodland peoples favored shorter boughs for thick forests, where branches punished long shots. On the plains, boughs stretched wider, built for distance and wind. In the Arctic, where trees were a rumor, Inuit hunters carved harpoons from bone, inlaid with stone blades so sharp they could split seal hide like silk. There was no universal tool, only universal ingenuity. Decoration, when it appeared, wasn't vanity. Carved notches might mark successful hunts or serve as prayers for accuracy. Paint could signify clan identity or appease a spirit. An object was never just an object, it was a bridge between flesh and spirit, hunter and hunted. What's remarkable is how these tools survived the centuries of colonial disruption that tried to erase them. The bow was replaced by rifles, the flint knife by steel, yet the craftsmanship never disappeared, it adapted. Even today, some hunters still make their own arrows the old way, more out of devotion than necessity, testing whether the hands remember what history nearly made them forget. Every sinew, every feather, every flake of stone carried the same lesson. The land provided everything, but only for those who approached it with respect. The hunter's tool wasn't an invention, it was a conversation in materials, one that demanded humility to participate in. And when the hunter finished sharpening his arrow or oiling his bow, he turned to his next ally, his clothing, the second skin that blurred the line between human and animal. To step into the hunt, one didn't simply dress, one vanished. The hunter's clothing was less an outfit and more an argument with visibility. Deer hide, elk skin, and bison robes formed the basic wardrobe, soft and sturdy enough to move without complaint. But they weren't chosen for comfort. They were chosen because they lied convincingly to the world. When you wore what the land had already accepted, the wind didn't question your presence. Across the Great Plains, hunters rubbed ash or clay onto their skin, dulling the gleam of sweat and muting their scent. Among the eastern woodlands, they stitched leaves or moss into the folds of their leggings, moving through the underbrush like one more rumor of movement. Some painted lines down their faces, not as decoration but as misdirection, a way to break the symmetry that betrayed humankind to animals far more perceptive than we like to admit. Fashion, for the hunter, was just sophisticated lying. Every element had function wrapped in ritual. The smell of smoke wasn't an accident. Before leaving camp, a hunter might stand near the fire so the scent masked his body. And not just any smoke, sage, cedar, or sweetgrass, depending on what the spirits and mosquitoes demanded that day. The same plants that kept insects away were also believed to keep arrogance in check. The hunter had to smell humble. But clothing wasn't purely tactical. It was also sacred theater. Certain hunts, the buffalo on the plains, the caribou in the north, required ceremony. Hunters might don headdresses of horn or fur, imitating the animal to honor it. The Cheyenne told of men who dreamed of particular beasts and thereafter wore parts of them, not to trick the herd, but to acknowledge kinship. You could disguise yourself as the thing you intended to kill, only if you promised not to forget what it had given you. Among the Inuit, seal hunting clothing was almost architectural, waterproofed with oil, stitched with sinew finer than thread, who'd drawn tight against the glare of ice. Even the seams had rhythm, every stitch a heartbeat of survival, every patch a quiet prayer that the sea would stay merciful. On the plains, buffalo robes served as winter armor and summer bedroll. A single hide could mean life or death, and so nothing about it was wasted. The inside might be scraped and softened until it felt like worn cloth, decorated with geometric lines or simple pictographs that recorded personal stories, not vanity, but memory. You didn't write history, you wore it, and there was always an undercurrent of irony. Hunters who dressed to disappear often became the most visually striking figures in their communities when they returned. Robes painted, fringes swinging, feathers trembling in the firelight, camouflage in the morning, spectacle by nightfall. They had to vanish to feed everyone, and then reappear to remind the tribe who'd done the vanishing. But even the finest hides, beads, and paint couldn't hide what the hunt demanded next. Stillness so deep that the body itself began to imitate the earth. Stillness was the real weapon. The bow, the spear, the trap, those were just accessories to an art form that required not moving until your muscles forgot they existed. The average Native American hunter could outsit a tree. He learned to stay motionless in snowstorms, swamps, and mosquito clouds dense enough to qualify as a spiritual trial. Modern people call that mindfulness. Back then, it was called not starving. The world of the hunt moved slowly, but everything inside it was alive with detail. A ripple in the grass meant breath. The sudden silence of birds meant danger. Even the wind had moods. Hunters studied it the way monks studied scripture, obsessively, respectfully, and slightly terrified of getting it wrong. Move against the wind, and your scent carried like gossip across the prairie. One sniff from a deer's nostrils, and the lesson was over. The Lakota said a good hunter could wait until his shadow forgot him. He'd lie flat in the sagebrush for hours, eyelids half closed, heart beating so quietly he could feel the soil answer. Every twitch, every blink was measured against necessity. Mosquitoes bit his neck, he didn't swat. Sweat trickled down his ribs, he didn't wipe it. Stillness wasn't self-control, it was submission to the landscape, a kind of rehearsal for death where, if you did it well, something else died instead. But patience wasn't just physical, it was moral. A restless man was dangerous to everyone. A single impulsive move could scatter a herd, ruin days of quiet tracking, and feed no one. Entire communities depended on the stillness of one body in a field. You weren't just waiting for the animal, you were waiting for yourself to stop being noisy. Some nations, like the Cree and the Pawnee, even treated the act of waiting as sacred. Before a hunt, a man might purify himself in a sweat lodge, to clear not just his skin, but his mind. The logic was poetic. If your thoughts were agitated, the wind would mirror them. If you entered the forest with fear, it would echo back in every rustle. Only calm could trick nature into cooperation. The silence of the hunter was the silence of prayer, and yet there was humor hidden in it. Older hunters loved watching apprentices fidget. "The deer will come," they'd whisper. After you've lost the feeling in your legs, there was always that dry laughter that said patience was the only initiation that mattered. Fail it, and you went home hungry. Pass it, and you returned with meat, stories, and legs that would never quite forgive you. Stillness blurred the line between hunter and landscape. After hours of it, people said they felt the earth breathing through them. Animals stopped seeing them as separate, a merging that made the kill almost philosophical. You weren't taking life so much as participating in a transfer. And when the arrow finally left the bow, it wasn't speed that mattered, but timing, the moment when the world held its breath, and you borrowed it. When it was over, and the body lay still in your place, the silence remained heavier, older, filled with gratitude, and something harder to name. And from that silence grew the next lesson, one even older than patience, the art of reading the earth itself. Tracking was the hunter's real literacy. To follow an animal wasn't just to see where it had gone, it was to read what it had thought. The earth was a book, and the text changed with every gust of wind. Each hoofprint, each bent blade of grass was a letter in a language the land only taught to those quiet enough to learn. Among the Apache, the difference between a fresh trail and a ghost, one could mean the line between dinner and a very long fast. They noticed the way a twig snapped, clean if it had just broken, frayed if days had passed. The Lakota could tell whether a bison was calm or frightened by how deep its hooves sank in mud. The Inuit could track a seal under snow by the faint condensation of its breath freezing on the surface. None of this was mystical. It was attention, weaponized. A hunter's gaze operated on absurd levels of detail. A scuff of dust on a rock told the direction of travel. Droppings revealed not just species but the animal's diet, and therefore its mood. Because yes, even caribou have bad days. Dew disturbed on grass said how long ago something had passed. To outsiders, it looked like magic. To the hunter, it was arithmetic, written in dirt. But it wasn't just the ground he read, it was everything. The angle of spiderwebs showed wind direction. The silence of insects revealed approaching footsteps. Ravens, circling overhead, could betray a wounded deer before the blood dried. Even the air told secrets. The faint musk of a herd carried miles, especially at dusk, when the world cooled enough to remember its own smells. Children grew up surrounded by this invisible literacy. A father might kneel beside a print, touch the edge of it, and simply grunt. The child was expected to see what that meant. Direction, time, weight, intention. There were no words for look closer. You either did or didn't. Hunters were raised too. Think like detectives who happened to be barefoot and cold most of the time. And when the trail went cold, because it always did, instinct filled the gaps logic couldn't. You'd ask yourself, where would I go if I were the deer? Toward water, away from wind, into shadow. It was empathy as a survival tool, imagining your own hunger until it matched the animals. The better you understood your prey, the more likely you were to find it, and the more you respected it once you did. There was also poetry in failure. A day of following signs that led nowhere wasn't wasted. It reminded you that the land didn't owe you an ending. The Pawnee used to say, "The trail is older than the foot," meaning, you're not the first to look, and you won't be the last. Tracking made arrogance impossible. The earth corrected you constantly. You thought you knew, and then the prints vanished into rock or snow or water, and the world chuckled in its quiet way. You started again, softer this time, listening harder. And when the trail at last led home, when the animal was cornered or waiting, the hunter rarely stood alone, because some hunts were too big, too sacred, or too dangerous for one set of eyes. That's when patience met cooperation, and silence became strategy. Hunting wasn't the lone wolf fantasy so many imagine. It was choreography. On the plains, especially during buffalo season, the hunt looked more like a silent opera performed by 200 people who had all agreed not to ruin it by speaking. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Blackfoot organized these drives with military precision. Everyone had a role: decoys to lure the herd, riders to steer them, signalers on distant hills raising dust or waving hides to communicate direction. No shouting, no horns, just instinct and trust. The goal wasn't to chase, it was to persuade. Hunters guided entire herds toward cliffs or wooden corrals called pounds. The buffalo jump was the most dramatic method, stampeding 1,000 beasts toward a drop so sudden it turned the air into thunder. It sounds brutal, and it was, but it also fed entire nations. The success of one afternoon's coordination could sustain hundreds through the winter. Every tendon, hide, and bone was used. The hunt was half tragedy, half triumph, fully sacred. In the forests, the choreography looked different but carried the same rhythm. Iroquois hunters formed quiet circles, moving like the slow closing of a hand. One slip of a twig, and the animal was gone. So everyone moved as if sharing the same heartbeat. The best hunters didn't just know where to aim. They knew how not to ruin someone else's shot. Cooperation wasn't moral, it was mathematical. Elders often led these hunts, but not because they were in charge. Leadership rotated depending on who'd read the signs best that season. Among the Plains tribes, a hunt chief might be chosen for a single expedition and then return to ordinary status after. Authority lasted only as long as success. Try that system in a modern boardroom, and half of middle management would vanish by Tuesday. When the kill came, the mood wasn't elation but organization. Women, children, and older men joined in immediately, stripping hides, slicing meat, setting up racks for drying. The efficiency was astonishing. What anthropologists later called a zero-waste economy. Even the stomach contents of the buffalo might become medicine. This wasn't environmentalism. It was accounting in the language of gratitude. Of course, mistakes in cooperation were legendary. Oral histories tell of overeager riders who spooked the herd too early, turning a promising day into chaos. The punishment wasn't physical. It was worse, public embarrassment. The elders might call him the wind who ruined supper, and that nickname would cling for decades. Nothing enforces teamwork like mockery. In winter hunts, the coordination turned even subtler. Hunters fanned out over snowfields, reading wind and terrain to push animals gently toward ambush points. Communication happened through body language, a raised eyebrow, a glance toward the horizon. Generations later, anthropologists would marvel at unspoken coordination. The hunters would have called it common sense. Large communal hunts also doubled as social glue. Tribes met, traded stories, exchanged partners, renewed alliances. The hunt wasn't just about feeding stomachs. It fed diplomacy. Many intertribal peace gatherings began with a cooperative drive, followed by days of feasting. It's hard to hold a grudge while chewing the same bison rib. But the success of these collective hunts depended on something even older than teamwork: rhythm. Knowing when to move, when to rest, when to listen for the first sound of hooves migrating north. Because the hunter's real schedule wasn't set by people at all. It belonged to the seasons themselves. The hunter's calendar wasn't written on paper, it was carved into instinct. Each season carried its own commandments, dictated by the tilt of the earth and the behavior of things with fur. Spring smelled of thawing ground and wet bark. It meant fishing nets, not arrows. Summer hummed with insects and caution. Meat spoiled fast. Autumn, though, that was the real season of motion. The air cooled, the herds thickened, and every camp began to stir like a great animal preparing to move. The Plains tribes followed the bison, whose migration was as predictable as sunrise and just as necessary. When the first herds appeared, black waves moving over the grass, it wasn't a surprise, it was a summons. Families packed their tipis, bundled hides, and followed the ancient routes that their grandparents had followed and their grandchildren would one day retrace. It wasn't wandering, it was choreography with the continent. Farther north, the Cree and the Dean timed their hunts with the movements of caribou, rivers, and fish runs. They didn't need maps because the map was the land itself, its frozen lakes, its thawed trails, its silences. Hunters could name places by smell alone: spruce for shelter, moss for dryness, the faint iron tang of water meaning spring was close. Seasons weren't boundaries, they were tides, pulling life from one place to another. In the woodlands, Algonquian-speaking peoples moved in smaller circles, summer near the rivers for fish and berries, winter deep in the forest for deer. They built caches of dried meat and pemmican in hollowed logs, nature's refrigerators, marking them with secret signs so rival hunters wouldn't accidentally discover their good fortune. This wasn't nomadism in the romantic sense. It was logistics so efficient that modern supply chains look clumsy by comparison. The rhythm of migration shaped not just where people went, but who they became. On the move, hierarchy dissolved. The man who built the last campfire might lead the next crossing. Children learned the landmarks like lullabies, the stone that looked like a turtle, the bend in the river that meant home was 3 sleeps away. Movement was identity. To stay still too long was to risk forgetting how the land breathed. And yet, movement didn't mean restlessness. It meant listening. Hunters could sense when it was time to leave without needing a meeting. The sky told them, the color of dawn, the angle of stars, the absence of certain bird calls. The land spoke in patterns so precise that a single misplaced breeze could unsettle an entire day's plans. But when you've lived generations inside that rhythm, you don't need calendars, you need memory and good legs. These seasonal migrations weren't just practical, they were spiritual rehearsals. To follow the herds was to participate in the great cycle of giving and taking. Hunters knew that the animals returned each year, not by chance but by consent, as if the land were offering renewal on the condition that humans remembered their place in the exchange. And before every hunt of the new season, before every step into that pact, there were rituals, purifications, songs, small offerings to the unseen. Because to take from the earth again, one had to first apologize for having done so before. No one simply walked out and hunted. That would have been like showing up to church drunk. Technically possible, spiritually suicidal. The hunter's preparation began in the mind, where arrogance was sanded down and replaced with quiet. In most native traditions, the animal wasn't just a resource, it was a person, one with agency, moods, and the occasional sense of humor. If it allowed itself to be caught, it was an act of generosity, not defeat. So before the chase came the conversation. Among the Ojibwe hunters purified themselves in sweat lodges, scrubbing the scent of yesterday's sins off their skin. The Lakota fasted for days to make their bodies clean enough for the spirits to notice. Others offered tobacco, cornmeal, or the first drop of water from a skin flask. The message was always the same. I know I'm small. Please feed me anyway. Dreams played a starring role in this quiet diplomacy. A vision of a deer or bear wasn't random. It was considered an invitation. The animal had chosen you, often with conditions attached. Don't waste, don't brag, don't take more than you need. Ignore those terms, and the spirit might cancel future appointments. Some hunters even painted the animals from their dreams on their lodges or weapons, not as trophies but as pacts in pigment. In the Arctic, Inuit seal hunters sang to the spirits of the sea. They believed that every seal's soul lived beneath the ice, with a goddess who kept count. Take too many, and she'd freeze the ocean out of spite. So hunters whispered gratitude as they cut the animal free, promising that the bones would be returned to the water intact, the seal's passport back to reincarnation. It's a theological system that makes modern sustainability efforts look half-hearted. Every culture had its own version of these courtesies. The Cree might tie a strip of meat to a tree branch as a gift for the forest spirit. The Hopi thanked Massaw, the guardian of the earth, before using any part of an animal's body. The Blackfoot carried sacred bundles, feathers, bones, or claws of past hunts, as proof that their relationship with the natural world was long-term and mutually supervised. To Western ears, this all sounds mystical. To the hunter, it was just etiquette. You don't insult the waiter who brings your food, and you certainly don't offend the deer that agrees to die for you. This was not animism as poetry. It was accounting, emotional, ecological, spiritual balance sheets, all meticulously updated through ritual. And for the hunter, these rituals weren't confined to the start. Even after a kill, he might rest his hand on the animal's head and whisper something private. The Cheyenne sometimes lit small fires to carry the spirit's smoke skyward. The Navajo sang brief chants to release the animal from suffering. These weren't sentimental acts, they were acknowledgments of debt. To live well meant dying politely, and hunting was the rehearsal for both. The hunter's dignity came not from power but restraint, from remembering that every full belly had a ghost attached. But no ritual, no matter how reverent, worked alone. Behind every hunter stood others, those who tanned, cooked, shaped, and preserved what he brought back. The silent economy of survival didn't end with the arrow's flight. It began in the hands waiting by the fire. If the hunt began in silence, it ended in noise, the thud of knives on bone, the hiss of fat on fire, the steady rhythm of scraping hides. This was the music of women's work, which was, in truth, the second half of the hunt. Men might have brought the animal home, but women transformed it into life. Without them, a successful hunter was just a man standing next to a corpse. In nearly every native community, the the real logistics of survival unfolded around women's hands. They were chemists without beakers, engineers without titles. The Lakota women softened hides with a mixture of marrow and elbow grease until the leather turned supple enough to wear through a winter. Ojibwe women boiled sinew into glue, shaped bones into awls, carved needles from antlers fine enough to pierce through tanned skin. Among the Inuit, women stitched waterproof parkas from seal gut, translucent, durable, and precise. Each seam was sealed with patience and prayer, because one loose stitch meant one dead hunter. And they didn't just process the animal. They preserved the tribe. Women cut meat into strips for drying, packed it with fat and berries into pemmican, a calorie bomb so dense it could keep an entire family alive through months of snow. They salted, smoked, and stored food with a mathematician's sense of proportion. When colonists later marveled that native peoples could live off the land, what they missed was that it was women doing the math. Ceremonially, their role was equally potent. In many tribes, women held authority over how meat was divided. Distribution wasn't charity. It was social engineering. Everyone received a share, and if you tried to hoard more, the women noticed, and they had long memories. Among the Blackfoot women who prepared the meat were considered spiritually clean, able to bless or curse a hunt simply by handling its yield with approval or disdain. The entire economy of gratitude passed through their fingers. Even in the most physically demanding hunts, women were never mere spectators. In matrilineal societies like the Cherokee or the Haudenosaunee, women controlled property, food stores, and ritual timing. If a hunt needed to happen, their consent mattered as much as the chief's, and when scarcity hit, it was the women who rationed, negotiated, and rebalanced the equation between need and respect. Some even joined the hunts themselves, a fact often erased by colonial accounts, too busy romanticizing warriors. Women in the Arctic set traps for fox and hare. Apache women hunted small game, and on the plains, older women sometimes rode along in buffalo chases, their precision compensating for younger men's enthusiasm. The gender boundary between who hunted and who harvested was far less rigid than history later pretended. But perhaps their greatest contribution was less visible. Storytelling. Around fires, women recounted hunting lore, embedding practical lessons inside gossip and myth. How to spot a wounded deer, how to skin without tearing, how to dry meat fast before a storm. Knowledge moved matrilineally, disguised as conversation. Every generation of hunters carried their mother's advice in their hands, sometimes literally, since the sinew that bound the bowstring likely came from an animal she'd cured herself. When men returned from the field, they didn't boast, they offered. The meat wasn't a trophy, it was a delivery. And the first to touch it, clean it, and name it was often a woman who'd already decided which part went to whom. Power, it turned out, had less to do with spears than with knives, and who held them when the hunt was over. Yet the same discipline that made a good provider, silence, coordination, precision, was also the training ground for something else entirely, the art of war. To learn to hunt was unintentionally to learn to fight. The same patience that stalked a deer could stalk an enemy. The same instincts that read a trail could read an ambush. Among the Plains tribes, boys who spent their youth tracking buffalo later became scouts, experts in invisibility who could vanish into grass taller than a man's pride. The Cheyenne used to say, "A loud hunter dies first." It worked equally well as a philosophy of battle. War and hunting shared a common choreography. Move with the wind, never rush, and let your opponent make the first mistake. Warriors and hunters both trained their bodies to stillness and their minds to restraint. A missed arrow on the hunt meant hunger. In war, it meant death. Either way, impatience was the villain. Even tactics overlapped. The circular encirclements used in buffalo drives later mirrored the ambush formations in battle. The buffalo jump had its human counterpart: surround, disorient, strike once. But war wasn't the goal, and it certainly wasn't glorified the way later cultures would insist. For many nations, the highest honor wasn't killing an enemy, it was touching him first, a practice known as counting coup. Courage measured by proximity, not body count. It came from the same ethic that governed the hunt: mastery over self, not others. To strike without hatred and live without fear, that was the real contest. Hunting also served as a peacekeeper. The migration of herds created natural boundaries between territories. Crossing another tribe's hunting ground without permission was an act of aggression. but just as often, shared hunting spaces were neutral ground for diplomacy. Trade networks and seasonal gatherings revolved around these places, where meat and pelts changed hands, and disputes were settled before they became wars. The hunter's path, ironically, was often the safest road between enemies. Even when conflict was inevitable, the discipline of the hunt shaped how it was carried out. Stealth over spectacle, precision over chaos. The Apache, masters of guerrilla warfare, drew their tactics from generations of stalking prey across the desert. They moved in small bands, striking quickly, vanishing completely, less an army than a moving silence. European soldiers called it savage warfare. The Apache called it Wednesday. The moral dimension of hunting also tempered violence. Killing for food was sacred. Killing for pride was forbidden. That line blurred during war, but the memory of balance of as the Egyptians would have said, kept destruction from turning habitual. After a battle, some tribes performed purification rites similar to post-hunt rituals. Sweat lodges, fasting, offerings to restore spiritual equilibrium. Even in victory, you had to cleanse the stain of taking life. Perhaps that's why peace treaties were often marked, not with signatures but with feasts. To share meat, to eat from the same animal, was to symbolically agree that survival, not dominance, was the shared goal. Food, not force, closed more disputes than arrows ever did. So the hunter learned to fight without losing his humanity, and to feed without losing his humility. And yet, the world was changing. By the 17th century, new creatures entered the scene, beasts of speed and thunder that would rewrite everything. The hunter thought he knew about movement, distance, and death. Change doesn't always arrive politely. Sometimes it gallops. The first time horses appeared on the Great Plains, people thought the earth had grown new animals from its own restlessness. Descendants of the Spanish herds gone feral, they multiplied faster than rumor. At first, they were just a curiosity, too strange, too loud, too European. But then a few hunters realized something world-altering. A horse could turn a man who once stalked bison on foot into something closer to a storm. Within 2 generations, entire cultures reshaped themselves around this new power. The Comanche, Lakota, and Crow became equestrian nations so quickly it made historians dizzy. The horse extended the hunter's body, his reach, his identity. The bow was redesigned for one-handed use, arrows shortened. Saddles and bridles appeared, crafted from buffalo hide and ingenuity. Children learned to ride before they could walk properly. Some tribes even joked that the horse was the new tippy pole. Without it, you weren't really living right. But power, as usual, came with its own trap. The horse made the hunt easier, yes, but it also made overhunting possible. Bison herds that once seemed infinite began to thin. Plains people were the first to notice, long before any European naturalist started counting bones. The hunt, once balanced by distance and exhaustion, now risked becoming reckless. For every galloping success, there was an unspoken worry. Had they just moved faster toward scarcity? Then came the gun, loud enough to scare the gods. Firearms arrived through trade, muskets, flintlocks, anything that made smoke, and decided who had the upper hand that season. The first tribes to acquire them, like the Ojibwe and the Huron, gained sudden leverage over rivals. For a time, diplomacy meant access to gunpowder. A bow could sing quietly for decades. A gun coughed once and needed feeding. Hunters adapted again, reluctantly. They saw the practical side. A musket dropped a bison at a distance no arrow could dream of, but they also saw what it did to silence. The echo of a shot rolled across valleys for miles, announcing your presence to everything with ears. The gun wasn't a conversation with the land. It was an interruption. Some hunters complained that even the wind didn't trust them anymore. Still, adaptation was survival. Tribes retooled old rituals for new tools. They cleansed rifles in the same smoke once used for bows, offered prayers over bullets as if they were feathers. Trade networks expanded, pulling tribes into the gravity of colonial economies. Iron replaced obsidian, lead replaced flint. Spirit remained. Yet the old ethic, patience, respect, proportion began to strain under the new scale of things. The horse and gun together made life faster, deadlier, louder. Hunts that once lasted days could now end in hours. And though the people still gave thanks, the animals seemed to vanish more quickly each winter. By the 1800s, the new tools of plenty had turned into instruments of collapse. Settlers followed the herds west, slaughtering bison not for hunger, but for sport and commerce. The very animals that had fed nations for millennia became casualties of someone else's idea of progress. Hunters who had once prayed for permission to take a single life now watched trains carrying thousands of hides eastward, and so the balance cracked. The rhythm broke. The silence that had once defined the hunt was replaced by gunfire, industry, and loss. Yet even in that devastation, the old patience didn't die. It simply went underground, waiting for a quieter season to return. Because the hunter's world, once infinite, was shrinking fast. The land was being measured, fenced, and sold, and the people who had read its every sign were now being told to stop walking it. The great silence that had once been the hunter's ally became a kind of mourning. By the mid-1800s, the land itself sounded different, not with hooves or wind, but with trains, axes, and the occasional gunshot echoing like punctuation in a long obituary. The bison, once so numerous they turned the horizon into a dark sea, were nearly gone. By 1889, fewer than 1,000 remained in the wild. You could have counted the survivors without running out of fingers and toes. For native hunters, this wasn't just famine, it was dismemberment. Entire economies, calendars, and cosmologies had been built around the migrations of animals, now vanishing under colonial appetite. U.S. military officers openly endorsed bison extermination, knowing it would starve tribes into submission. The policy was as efficient as it was cruel. Where herds once moved like weather, the prairies now stood empty, vast, haunted grass. The loss wasn't confined to the plains. In the forests of the Great Lakes, logging stripped away deer cover. Trapping companies, run by French and British traders, demanded furs in industrial quantities, beaver, otter, fox, collapsing populations faster than they could reproduce. The Cree and Ojibwe, who once hunted for need, were pulled into a cycle of debt and dependency. The gun and the ledger had replaced the bow and the prayer. Even sacred relationships eroded. The animals no longer gave themselves because there was no one left to ask properly. Rituals were banned under Christian mission laws. Ceremonial fires were replaced by rations and sermons. Hunters who had once prepared with fasting and song now needed a permit. The patience that had defined existence for thousands of years was suddenly illegal. Reservations cut through migratory paths like fences through veins. Game disappeared, not because it was hunted, but because it was fenced out. Rivers were diverted for agriculture. Forests burned for railroad ties. The buffalo jump turned metaphorical. Entire nations driven toward cliffs of policy and starvation. Some adapted tribes like the Nez Perce and the Blackfoot turned to horse breeding. The Inuit leaned heavier on fishing and trade. The Hopi and Navajo increased farming under impossible conditions. But for many, the transformation wasn't adaptation, it was survival through erasure. The hunter who once moved freely through sacred geography was now a trespasser on his own story. Anthropologists later described this era as the end of the traditional hunt. That's tidy, academic, and wrong. The hunt didn't end, it went invisible. It lived in songs whispered at night, in dances disguised as celebrations, in the old men who still walked to the edge of reservation lines just to smell the wind, to remember how it once carried the scent of herds instead of coal. And through all this quiet resistance, one thing endured, the memory of how to listen. Even when the animals were gone, hunters still read the land, not for prey anymore, but for proof that they had once belonged to it. That listening, passed quietly from one generation to the next, became an act of defiance, and from that defiance came legacy, the slow return of meaning in a world that had tried to silence it. For people whose lives had been measured in seasons, silence, and tracks, the end of the hunt could never really mean the end of being hunters. You can take away the herds, the weapons, even the land, but you can't unteach someone how to listen to wind. The rhythm remained, buried in language, ceremony, and muscle memory. Modern native hunters, whether in Alaska, Oklahoma, or the northern plains, still carry that quiet education, the ability to see more by moving less. Today, hunting among indigenous communities isn't nostalgia, it's continuity with teeth. In Alaska, subsistence hunters still follow seal migrations with snow machines instead of sleds, but the ritual is the same. A prayer, a breath, a shot offered with apology. On the Great Plains, bison have returned to tribal lands through decades of reclamation efforts. The hunts are ceremonial, yes, but also political acts of restoration disguised as meals. They feed not just stomachs, but sovereignty. Elders teach children to track again, to notice how snow holds memory, how trees lean toward light, how silence answers questions better than words. The lesson is ancient, but now carries defiance. Every step in the forest is a reminder that indigenous survival didn't end in the museum. It's out there, knee-deep in mud, trying not to spook the deer. The tools have changed. Rifles, scopes, GPS, but the etiquette hasn't. Before taking a life, hunters still offer tobacco, still whisper gratitude. Waste remains a sin. The bones, if not buried, are honored. Some tribes revive older practices with modern awareness, limiting numbers, sharing meat communally, treating conservation as ceremony rather than bureaucracy. You won't find many trophies on their walls. The victory is in balance, not accumulation. And the humor persists, dry as ever. Elders tease the young ones who rush a shot or check their phones mid-hunt. The deer already unfriended you. Laughter is survival language, proof that reverence doesn't require solemnity. It's the same old joke. You're never hunting animals, just your own impatience. But underneath the laughter lies something heavier, a recognition that the hunt is the last place where time still feels honest. Out there, far from engines and headlines, the hunter steps into an older world, one where nothing moves without reason. The air carries stories older than writing. Every footprint, feather, and echo feels like an ancestor's reminder. You were meant to move this way. That's what remains, the knowing, the sense that humanity is not separate from the things it pursues. The hunt, stripped of glamour and myth, becomes a kind of meditation, an act of remembering how to belong. Every arrow loosed, every prayer whispered over a carcass, every silent morning in the frost is a small rebellion against forgetting. So, yes, the modern native hunter still waits for the wind to shift, still reads the grass like scripture, still apologizes for the kill. He does it because someone has to remember the correct posture for being alive, quiet, patient, grateful, and absolutely aware that the earth doesn't owe him a thing. That's not sport. That's survival, polished into reverence, sharpened by loss, and passed down like a secret to sacred, to stop saying aloud. Because even now, the land listens for those who still know how to move without breaking it. Tracking wasn't a craft you learned, it was a personality you inherited. In most traditional societies, the best trackers weren't necessarily the strongest or the fastest. They were the quiet ones. The ones who noticed when a blade of grass was bent the wrong way, or when silence suddenly became too perfect. They weren't just looking for signs of life, they were listening for it, in a way that modern people, armed with GPS and stress disorders, have mostly forgotten how to do. Among the San in southern Africa, hunters said that every living thing left behind a kind of echo, a presence you could feel with your body if you stopped trying to think with your head. They called it the flow of the hunt, that strange state when time slowed, the eyes softened, and the world stopped being a background. Every rustle, every breeze meant something. A bent stem wasn't random, it was testimony. A tracker didn't see grass, he saw a sentence. To track, you had to let go of the idea of separation, to forget that you were a human watching nature. The Apache tracker might crouch, press his ear to the ground, and mutter, "He's walking tired," not as metaphor but as literal diagnosis. It sounds poetic until you realize he was right. Gait, depth, and rhythm in a footprint can reveal fatigue. The skill bordered on absurd. Trackers could tell the difference between a kudu running from fear and one spooked by insects, between a group of antelope being hunted and one just bored. But calling it a skill misses the point. Tracking was closer to trance. You weren't gathering evidence, you were dissolving into awareness. The tracker's mind expanded until it included the terrain, the animal, the wind. He didn't find the trail, he became it. And while that sounds mystical, it's neurologically accurate. The brain literally shifts into a heightened pattern recognition mode, blending logic with intuition. Every sense, including ones we've politely forgotten exist, came online. The eerie part was how normal this seemed to them. When a group of Hadza hunters in Tanzania were once asked how they could follow footprints invisible to outsiders, they just laughed. Invisible to who? They said. The answer wasn't arrogance, it was confusion. To them, we were the ones who'd gone blind. There's a certain irony in that. Modern life measures intelligence in how fast we can recall information. Ancient trackers measured it in how long we could wait for the earth to speak. And when it did, it didn't shout. It whispered in sand and dew, in the faint bend of a spiderweb. The trackers knew that sight wasn't what found the animal attention did. And it's in that silence, that particular brand of holy quiet, that the next truth begins to stir. That the land wasn't a stage full of props to be decoded. It was alive, articulate, and occasionally sarcastic, if you knew how to read it properly. To a tracker, the ground was never just ground. It was a page that rewrote itself with every gust of wind and every paw that pressed against it. The landscape wasn't passive, it was verbose. Every dune, puddle, and broken twig participated in a conversation older than agriculture. The hunter wasn't the author. He was the reader, squinting at a script written in dust and silence. The sand spoke of the earth as something with moods. Some mornings, the sand was awake, its surface crisp and generous with detail. Other days, it sulked, smooth and withholding, forcing you to earn every clue. Even the light played editor. Harsh sun flattened tracks into invisibility. Evening brought them back like faint handwriting illuminated by candlelight. The world hid and revealed itself according to temperament, not convenience. In the Great Basin, Paiute trackers learned to read the shadows of things rather than the things themselves. A scuffed rock might tell you nothing, but its shadow deeper on one side betrayed the direction of pressure. In the Kalahari, tiny displacements of pebbles spoke of antelope, hyena, or human long before anyone saw movement. It wasn't superstition, it was forensic attention before the word forensic existed. To the Apache, footprints were more like signatures, personal, expressive, unique. The spacing between steps could show hesitation or confidence. They read it like emotion, because in a world where you live by your senses, everything emotional leaves a trace. Even hesitation has texture if you look long enough. But perhaps the strangest thing about this literacy was that it worked both ways. The land was watching back. In many cosmologies, the earth was a living being that remembered where you walked, what you took, what you gave. Some stories said the soil recorded human behavior and reported it to the spirits, which was a poetic way of saying, don't be an idiot, the world keeps receipts. Anthropologists later tried to categorize this as animism, which is a polite academic way of saying they thought everything was alive. But that's not quite it. The tracker didn't think the land was alive. He experienced it as alive. Every step confirmed it. When he placed his hand on the ground, he wasn't performing mysticism. He was tuning in. The vibration of hooves, the temperature of soil, the softness of moss, each detail carried time within it. Imagine standing still long enough to sense the direction of wind, not on your skin but in your bones, to feel the trail not as something seen but as something remembered. That was reading the land, the way others read scripture. A tracker read terrain. And once you could read that language fluently, the next step was inevitable. You began to think, not about the animal, but as the animal. Empathy stopped being emotional. It became practical, even predatory. At some point, the act of following a trail crossed over into something that looked suspiciously like possession. The tracker didn't just imagine what the animal might do, he inhabited it. He slipped, step by step, into another nervous system. Among the Ruhonzi, this was called enopum, the vital energy that woke up in the body when one's awareness blurred with something else's. The hunter's breathing slowed to match the antelope's. His heartbeat fell into rhythm with its stride. Somewhere between exhaustion and trance, he stopped being a man in pursuit and became a shadow escorting its double. That sounds romantic until you remember the stakes. Miss a sign and you went hungry. Misjudge your own heartbeat, and the animal heard you before you saw it. Empathy wasn't a virtue here, it was survival strategy. The tracker's mind dissolved the boundary between observer and observed because the prey's life depended on it, and so did his. This kind of mimicry wasn't performance, it was identification. The Apache spoke of walking in the animal's footprints before it makes them. Hunters in the Amazon said the spirit of the animal allowed itself to be seen, only if the human remembered its habits correctly. A cosmic pop quiz on behavioral empathy. The Inuit hunter stalking seal through a blowhole believed that if he thought too much about the meat, the seal would sense greed and stay hidden. Thought itself became scent. Desire had to be disguised as patience. When tracking in this state, people described moments of eerie synchronicity, turning just as the animal turned miles away. stopping mid-step for no reason, then finding fresh droppings exactly where their body had told them to expect it. Western psychology would call that intuition. The tracker called it proof that the world still spoke fluent empathy, and in that fragile merging, something profound happened. The hunt became ritual. Every movement was calibrated, not just to find, but to honor the other being's awareness. Hunters apologized before loosing an arrow, whispering thanks as though the animal had willingly presented itself. In the high Arctic, men would stroke the muzzle of a seal and speak softly so its spirit wouldn't resent them later. To kill without connection was not just disrespectful, it was cosmically foolish. The spirits had long memories, and vengeance didn't always wait until the next life. The irony is that the deeper the empathy, the harder the kill. Some trackers confessed to hesitating when they finally caught up, as if looking into the mirror and realizing the reflection was bleeding. That moment, heavy and unsentimental, became the point of spiritual reckoning. The animal's life wasn't lost, it was transferred, and the human now carried the obligation of that life to feed others, to remain grateful, to never pretend it was easy. And that moral gravity demanded preparation, purification of the body, calm of the mind, rituals meant to steady the line between compassion and necessity. Because to step into another creature's consciousness, you had to make sure your own wasn't a mess. Before a tracker could read the earth or enter the mind of an animal, he had to clean the static from himself. You couldn't just roll out of bed, grab a bow, and expect the antelope to forgive your bad mood. The world, as far as traditional hunters were concerned, had excellent emotional radar. Anger, hunger, arrogance, all of it traveled ahead of you like scent. So before stepping into the wild, you washed not just your body but your noise. Across cultures, this ritual quieting took different forms but carried the same logic. Harmony attracts, chaos repels. The Apache bathed in cold rivers before dawn, their skin prickling awake, their minds forced into stillness by the shock. The sand burned herbs like buku or wild sage, letting the smoke cling to them as a kind of spiritual deodorant, one that masked human smell and, according to them, arrogance. In the Arctic, Inuit hunters rubbed themselves with snow to erase their scent completely. The cold, they said, humbled the flesh. Fasting was common too, not as self-denial but as calibration. Hunger sharpened the senses. It made the world louder. When your stomach growled, you could feel the same pulse that moved through everything else that hungered. Fasting turned empathy into physiology. The hunter didn't just understand the animal's desperation, he felt it. There were also taboos. You didn't argue before a hunt. You didn't make jokes about the animal you sought. You didn't brag about what you'd do when you found it. Words, after all, had weight, and in most indigenous cosmologies, sound itself was a form of creation. Speak carelessly, and you might accidentally will something into being. The wrong kind of arrogance could literally manifest bad luck. Anthropologists later noted that in some groups, even mentioning the name of the animal aloud was forbidden. It wasn't superstition. It was etiquette. You don't gossip about someone before asking them for a favor. And all these acts, the washing, the fasting, the silence, weren't isolated rituals. They were training in perception. Purification wasn't about morality. It was about focus. A mind cluttered with resentment or pride simply couldn't see the subtle signs the earth offered. Clean hands, clear sight, that was the rule. The tracker, in essence, became a tuning fork, stripped of distraction until the landscape could vibrate through him. Some hunters claimed that once purified, they could sense movement even without seeing it. The San called this the heartbeat of the veldt, a resonance that connected every living thing. They said you could feel a herd miles away, the rhythm of its motion traveling invisibly through the ground. Modern science, of course, calls that nonsense, and then turns around to publish papers about magnetic fields and resonance frequencies in animal migration. The old hunters must find that hilarious. Purification didn't end when the tracking began. Every gesture during the hunt, every pause, every breath, was a continuation of the same discipline. Stillness was the prayer. Movement was the response. And once the world started to answer back, silence became sacred. Because the land had finally decided you were clean enough to hear it speak. And so the next lesson arrived, quiet as dusk and twice as weighty, that silence itself wasn't just strategy, but communion. Silence wasn't just the absence of noise, it was etiquette, reverence, and maybe the closest thing to prayer that ever existed outside of temples. For the tracker, Speaking during a hunt was like interrupting a sermon being delivered by wind. Every sound had consequence. A snapped twig, a careless cough, even the rhythm of breath could offend the listening earth. In the Great Plains, hunters used to say that words traveled farther than arrows. The Cheyenne believed that every unnecessary sound reached the spirits before it reached anyone else. If you had something trivial to say, it was better to save it for the fire. And among the Apache, silence wasn't a command, it was culture. They believed wisdom lived in quiet people, that the less you said, the more you saw. Conversation was saved for camp. The world outside was already speaking. Interrupting it was just bad manners. Anthropologists once asked a sand tracker why he never spoke during the chase. He smiled and said, "Because the animals don't." The simplicity of that answer hides something profound. Speech was considered an intrusion, a way of turning yourself into an echo, louder than the world itself. Silence wasn't a void. It was presence, finely tuned. It's strange to think of silence as a form of intimacy, but that's exactly what it was. In those long hours of stillness, you weren't withdrawing from the environment, you were joining it. Birds, insects, even the shifting temperature of the air became part of the conversation. You could feel when something changed, when the forest held its breath, when the insects suddenly went mute, when the air thickened as if watching. Those were the moments when silence spoke the loudest. Some cultures even personified silence. For the Ojibwe, it was a companion spirit, not emptiness, but a living presence that traveled with the hunter, protecting him from distraction. They said silence walked a few paces ahead, clearing the path of confusion. It wasn't superstition. It was phenomenology wrapped in poetry. They simply understood what modern mindfulness teachers are still trying to sell, that quiet attention rearranges perception. Silence also enforced humility. It prevented boasting, impulsive killing, and unnecessary cruelty. The disciplined quiet before a strike reminded the hunter that he wasn't taking life, he was being permitted to. A loud man broke that illusion, and in doing so, broke trust with the land. Many traditions held that if you mocked your prey or spoke arrogantly, your next hunt would fail. The forest would simply stop answering your call. And yet, silence wasn't all solemnity. Around campfires, hunters often joked that the reason the animals allowed themselves to be caught was just to make someone finally shut up. Dry humor wrapped around reverence, the best kind of balance. But there were moments when silence went deeper, slipping from habit into revelation. When days of tracking stretched without success, when hunger tightened the stomach and the landscape refused to yield its secrets, silence became something mystical, an opening between worlds. The hunter began to feel guided by dreams, visions, and omens rather than tracks. Because in the stillness, what could not be seen started to whisper from elsewhere. And those whispers led to the next truth, that tracking didn't stop at the edge of the physical trail. It extended into the invisible one, mapped in dreams, symbols, and signs only the patient could interpret. When the tracks disappeared, and they always did, the tracker turned to dreams. In the anthropological sense, this wasn't mysticism. It was navigation through another layer of reality. For many traditional hunters, the visible trail was only half the map. The rest was drawn in sleep. Among the Ojibwe, it was believed that animals sent dreams to worthy hunters, showing them where to find food, not out of pity, but out of agreement. A good hunter didn't conquer, he negotiated. The sand said that at night, the spirit of the hunter walked ahead of his waking body, finding the animal before dawn and leaving signs for him to follow, which is just a poetic way of saying that intuition, when trained well enough, feels supernatural. In northern Canada, Cree hunters interpreted omens with a mathematician's precision. A sudden shift in wind, a bird flying against its flock, the crack of ice before sunrise, each sign pointed somewhere specific. The tracker didn't wonder if the world was speaking, he simply wondered what it was saying today. There were no coincidences, only missed translations. Dreams were treated like coordinates. A hunter might wake up and say, "The elk was drinking from the crooked river," then walk straight to a bend he'd never visited before and find tracks there. From a Western perspective, it sounds convenient, until you realize that this form of luck came from decades of immersion. When you've spent your life reading weather, movement, and shadow, your subconscious becomes a remarkably accurate compass. But to the hunters themselves, that wasn't psychology, it was relationship. The animal was a teacher, and dreams were its letters. Some even said the animal allowed itself to be caught because it recognized something pure in the dreamer, which adds an odd moral dimension to sleep. Your ethics determined your luck. Greedy or careless people dreamed nothing but nonsense. The Apache had a saying, "The land gives you one language in daylight and another in dreams." Their shamans used both. They'd fast, sing, and then lie in silence waiting for a vision that showed them not what to pursue, but when. The timing was sacred. Track on the wrong day, and even the prince would lie to you. And omens weren't just personal, they were social events. Before big hunts, elders might gather and watch how fire burned, steady or flickering, or which direction smoke leaned. The universe was full of small hints, and ignoring them was as reckless as ignoring weather. This blending of dream logic and fieldwork blurred any neat line between science and spirituality. Tracking wasn't superstition, it was empiricism expanded to include intuition. It assumed the cosmos was responsive. That's the unsettling part. It treated awareness as mutual. The hunter sought the deer, but the deer, in some sense, sought him back. Which is why success in tracking had less to do with eyesight, and more to do with character. You could read every sign perfectly, and still go hungry if your attitude was wrong. The animals, it was said, could smell arrogance faster than smoke. And that brings us to the ethical heartbeat of the entire practice. The quiet, unspoken law that held all this together. Tracking wasn't just about skill or insight, it was about worthiness. For all the talk of skill, technique, and luck, the real secret of tracking was moral hygiene. It wasn't just, can you find the animal, it was should you. Hunters believed that success depended not on strength or strategy, but on conduct. The animal's spirit had opinions, and they weren't shy. If you were greedy, boastful, or ungrateful, the trail went cold. Simple as that. In the Arctic, Inuit hunters said that the seal would turn its back on an unworthy man, not metaphorically, but literally. He could stand over a breathing hole all day and the seal just wouldn't rise. Among the San, it was said that the eland, a sacred antelope, could sense arrogance and would vanish into the invisible. The hunter's heart had to be calm, clean, almost transparent. A restless mind, they said, left heavy footprints. This moral code wasn't preached by priests or elders. It was enforced by starvation. Nature was judge and jury. Waste a kill, mock your prey, or brag about your shot, and next season the grass itself might refuse to show you where anything had passed. To the Apache, that wasn't punishment, it was correction. The land wasn't vindictive, it was teaching manners. Among plains hunters, gratitude was non-negotiable. After every successful kill, a small ritual of thanks was performed, a handful of tobacco scattered, a prayer whispered, sometimes a brush of the hand along the animal's fur. The point wasn't theology, it was acknowledgement. You didn't take life, you received it. There's a difference that modern consumers, detached from the moment of death, rarely feel. Anthropologists like Richard Nelson noted that in many indigenous groups, animals were considered people of another nation. They weren't resources. They were partners in an ongoing exchange. The hunter's job was to maintain the relationship, break it, and you invited famine. Honor it, and the animals returned willingly. There's something hauntingly practical about that system. By wrapping ecological balance inside moral law, it prevented overhunting without a single written rule. Ethics became survival strategy disguised as spirituality. Kill too much, and you sinned against both the gods and next winter's food supply. And the social side was just as strict. Bragging was a sin. Among the Cree, the man who boasted about his hunt was mocked, not for arrogance alone, but because his words might scare away future luck. Some even attributed misfortune to loose talk, claiming that spirits listened for pride. The idea wasn't fear, it was balance. Pride tilts the scale, and when the scale tips, everything in nature adjusts to even it out, usually at your expense. Even generosity was part of the contract. The first meat went to elders, widows, or those unable to hunt. It wasn't charity, it was currency. Giving kept the cycle turning. It reminded everyone, human and non-human, that life was communal. The hunter was only ever a conduit, never the center. But maintaining that balance required teaching, and teaching required restraint. The next generation couldn't be taught this morality through lectures. It had to be absorbed through silence, repetition, and watching, because the only thing worse than talking too much in the hunt was teaching too loudly about it. And so the art of tracking passed on quietly, one patient gesture at a time. Tracking wasn't taught, it was absorbed, like heat from a fire you'd been sitting beside your whole life. The elders never gathered children in neat lines to explain the difference between a rabbit's footprint and a fox's. They simply walked, and if you were smart enough, you followed. The lesson was, watch. The exam was survival. A San elder once told an anthropologist, if you have to be told, you're not ready to learn. Brutal, yes, but efficient. Children were expected to imitate rather than ask. They crouched where adults crouched, mimicked the tilt of the head, the way the eyes softened instead of focused. Curiosity wasn't rewarded with answers, it was rewarded with permission to witness, because in that world, knowledge wasn't information, it was patience that had ripened. Among the Apache, even speech was rationed in teaching. Elders rarely explained the why behind a method. They'd point, grunt, or say a single word. Look. The idea was to let the mind learn through its own senses, not someone else's certainty. Modern educators would call this experiential learning. The Apache would call it common sense. If the world is your classroom, the land itself is the only instructor qualified to speak. Silence, in this sense, wasn't empty. It was full, dense with signals, layered with texture. The wind had tempo, the soil had accents, the birds announced events like gossiping neighbors. The young learned to translate all this without fanfare. A child who laughed too loudly during a hunt wasn't scolded. The elders simply stopped walking. The silence that followed was heavier than any punishment. You learned quickly that sound had consequences. Observation wasn't passive either. It was creative, a kind of decoding mixed with empathy. When the elders read the land, they weren't memorizing, they were interpreting. Each clue was an invitation to guess what came next. And children were trained to guess until guessing became knowing. Don't ask where the antelope went. One San proverb says, ask where you would go if you were an antelope. It's the earliest form of perspective taking. Psychology with dust under its fingernails. Even mistakes were sacred. If a child misread a track and led the group astray, no one shouted. They just retraced their steps in silence. The shame was self-contained. The land corrected you better than anyone could. And once you learned that humility didn't kill you, only pride did, you started to pay attention. The pedagogy of silence also protected the knowledge itself. The less said, the less could be stolen or misunderstood. This was a world where wisdom wasn't democratized, it was earned. Elders carried entire ecological systems in their memories, passed down like oral encryption keys. To speak those teachings carelessly would dilute their power. By the time a young hunter was ready to track alone, he had internalized something subtler than skill, a way of seeing that blurred the line between discipline and devotion. He didn't just look for animals anymore. He looked for himself in the pattern of their movement. And when the time came to face death, not metaphorically, but in the literal, blood-on-sand way, all those quiet lessons culminated in a single moment of reckoning. Because tracking always ended with something dying, and that demanded its own education, one in reverence, restraint, and the strange continuity between taking life and preserving it. Every trail, no matter how reverent the pursuit, ended in the same place, the trembling stillness after death. The tracker, who had spent days merging with the animal's heartbeat, now stood before its silence. It wasn't victory. It was a kind of stunned intimacy. The kill was the briefest, most difficult conversation between equals. Among the San, the moment of death was considered sacred, not triumphant, not tragic, but balanced. They said the animal gave itself when the hunter's intention was clean. If the shot was made carelessly, if greed or pride guided the hand, the spirit of the animal would wander, confused and resentful. The meat might rot early, or the hunter would dream of being chased. It wasn't guilt, it was cosmology. Life, they believed, moved in loops, not lines. What you took would eventually come back looking for you. After the kill, there were gestures meant to restore that symmetry. The Apache whispered apologies into the animal's ear. The Inuit placed fresh water in the seal's mouth so its soul wouldn't thirst on its journey. The plains hunters scattered sage or tobacco, acknowledging that what just happened wasn't ownership, it was exchange. In every case, the death was ritualized not to romanticize it, but to domesticate it, to keep it from spilling into cruelty. Even the anatomy of the process carried moral instruction. Skinning was done slowly, as if undressing something sacred. The bones were kept aligned, never broken unnecessarily. Children helped, but were never allowed to treat it like spectacle. They were taught to notice weight, warmth, and change, to understand that death wasn't an end, but a transformation. The animal became sustenance, tools, shelter, song. In giving its body, it entered the human world. There's a peculiar tenderness in that. The hunter, who'd once merged with the animal in empathy, now completed the union through nourishment. Eating was remembrance, not indulgence. In many societies, the first bite was taken in silence, a wordless promise to use everything well. It was theology rendered edible, and the act of sacrifice wasn't one-sided. The hunters also gave parts of the kill, the heart, the liver, sometimes the blood, were offered back to the earth or burned for the spirits. Some tribes buried the first bones of the season under stones, believing that doing so allowed the animal's soul to be reborn. Death, in this sense, wasn't loss. It was compost for the sacred. Modern anthropology tends to analyze this as ritual guilt management, which is like describing love as proximity tolerance. The truth is simpler and deeper. The hunter wasn't apologizing for killing, he was maintaining the rhythm. Death was part of the grammar of life. Skip a line, and the language falls apart. And it's this rhythm, the endless reciprocity between hunger and humility, that carried the hunter's worldview into the modern age. Even when the old trails vanished under fences and roads, the code survived. But what happens to a language when there's no one left to speak it? That's where the last story begins. Not about hunting animals, but about hunting memory itself. The last true trackers are disappearing, not because the skill is outdated, but because the world has gotten too loud to hear them. Silence, that sacred condition that once revealed every secret of the earth, is now drowned beneath engines, algorithms, and a kind of human static that never sleeps. The old hunters say that the land still speaks, but no one listens long enough anymore to understand its accent. In Namibia, a few remaining sand trackers still walk the Kalahari barefoot, reading the sand-like scripture. They identify a footprint days old, and tell you what the animal was thinking when it made it. He was running from lions, one might say, then point out a barely visible curve in the sand. Proof, written in dust. Scientists who've studied them call their ability hyperacuity. The trackers just shrugged. To them, this is normal vision. We're the ones who see poorly. In the Amazon, elders lament that younger hunters rely more on sound recorders and GPS than on intuition. They can find the animal, one said, but not themselves. That line belongs in a philosophy book, but it was spoken casually, while skinning a fish. Across continents, you hear versions of the same grief, not over lost methods, but over lost awareness. Tracking, at its heart, wasn't about pursuit. It was about relationship. Lose that, and you lose your coordinates in existence itself. Even modern trackers, soldiers, rangers, biologists, admit that what the ancients did borders on the mystical. But mysticism, in this case, was just attentiveness stretched to its full human potential. When a Kalahari tracker says he feels an animal's direction, he isn't guessing. He's synthesizing microscopic cues, displaced sand grains, insect silence, wind eddies, so fast that his body knows before his mind does. It's the original form of intelligence, one that happens below the level of language. And that's the tragedy. We've built a world where knowing means naming, measuring, recording, not feeling. We've turned perception into data, and in doing so, dulled the very organ that used to connect us to the living world. The San elders laugh gently at this. They say, "You people read books. We read the ground. One isn't better than the other," they add, "but one definitely smells more like dust than reality." Still, fragments of that older consciousness survive. In reworlding programs, indigenous rangers are being asked to teach their methods again, to track not for hunting, but for healing, to find lost animals, yes, but also to remind the rest of us that attention itself is a form of prayer. In Alaska, hunters teach children to read snow as language. In Australia, the practice of songlines, mapping geography through chant and memory, is being revived. The old ways never died, they just went underground, waiting for quiet. Maybe that's what tracking has always been, a rebellion at forgetting, a reminder that the world was once navigated not by force, but by familiarity. That every creature, every footprint, every gust of wind was part of a grand conversation we were born fluent in, and then, somehow, chose to stop speaking. Even now, if you stand still long enough, the earth will begin to speak again. You'll notice how the grass leans, how the air thickens before rain, how silence folds itself differently at dusk. You'll remember that to find anything, an animal, a trail, even yourself, you must first learn to listen like the ancients did, without words, without hurry, and without the arrogance of believing the world was ever mute, because tracking was never a skill. It was prayer performed on foot, the quiet art of remembering that nothing truly hides from the patient. An arrow was never just a piece of sharpened wood. It was a confession carved into motion. To the hunter, it carried intention, the kind that lingered long after release. Across continents and centuries, arrows were said to remember the hands that made them. If your thoughts were unsteady, so was your shot. A cruel or boastful man could polish his arrow until it gleamed, but it would still betray him in flight. The world, as most traditional hunters saw it, had an excellent sense of irony. Among the plains peoples of North America, the bow and arrow weren't mere instruments of meat procurement. They were continuations of the body, ribs of the human will. Warriors believed that the spirit flowed through the bow, through the string, and finally through the arrow, which became a fragment of the self set free. The Apache called it the voice of the heart in the wind. The Bushmen of the Kalahari described their poisoned arrows as living fire, not because of toxicity, but because each arrow carried a fragment of the hunter's own the inner energy that animated all life. Once loosed, it couldn't be called back. In Japan, samurai archers whispered prayers over their arrows before battle, tiny, clipped sentences intended to focus thought and calm trembling hands. The arrow wasn't just meant to hit, it was meant to speak on behalf of the archer's intent. Accuracy without honor was considered an insult to the gods. The Mongols shared a similar conviction, that a well-shot arrow could only come from a tranquil mind. They trained not just their muscles, but their temper. You couldn't shoot true if your thoughts were loud. The connection between mind and motion wasn't poetic, it was practical. A distracted hunter missed, an angry one wounded and lost the trail. But a calm hunter, one whose breath and heartbeat matched the rhythm of the earth, his arrow struck cleanly, swiftly, mercifully. In that sense, every arrow was a mirror. You could read a person's spirit in the way it flew. And this belief meant that crafting arrows wasn't a chore. It was devotion disguised as carpentry. The shaping, the polishing, the feathering, all done in a kind of reverent silence, as if the wood might overhear any doubt, because it would. The hunter's soul wasn't separate from the object in his hand. It was distributed in the grain of the shaft, the tension of the bowstring, and the breath caught just before release. The arrow didn't just travel through space, it carried emotion, memory, and promise, which made the next step even more delicate, because before an arrow could fly true, it first had to be born through ritual, patience, and gratitude. The act of making an arrow began long before the first cut of wood. It started with permission. A tree wasn't harvested, it was asked. Among the Lakota, hunters spoke to the willow before taking its branch, promising that what they made from it would honor the world, not wound it. In the Arctic, sinew from reindeer was twisted into cords only after a prayer of gratitude was murmured, the kind of prayer so soft it barely qualified as sound. You didn't demand materials, you negotiated with them. Each component had its own personality. The shaft was the spine, strength and direction. The feathers were the breath, guidance and grace. The stone tip was the will, sharp, decisive, sometimes cruel. To craft without respect was to offend the spirits that lent these gifts. Anthropologists often noted how a single arrow could take days to make, not for lack of tools, but because the process was deliberately slowed. The repetition, the sanding, the quiet humming, all of it designed to steady the maker's mind. A restless man built restless arrows. Across the Kalahari, hunters softened reeds over embers until they bent like language. The smoke, they said, carried their thoughts into the arrow's grain. Some spat gently on the tip before attaching it, a symbolic act of life breath, animating the weapon before it ever left their hands. Others whispered the names of ancestors as they fletched feathers, asking them to guide the flight. The gesture was both superstition and engineering. Prayer and aerodynamics fused neatly into one motion. Every piece came from a relationship, the bird that gave its feathers, the sinew from the last hunt, the stone chipped with songs. There's something almost unsettling about that level of intimacy. The hunter held, in miniature, an entire ecosystem: wind, animal, fire, water, and human all converged into one straight line of purpose. When the final arrowhead was attached, the weapon wasn't tested first. It was blessed. In Japan's Kaido, even now, the archer bows to the bow, to the arrow, to the target, and finally to the space between, acknowledging that all four are one continuous event. Among native groups in the Americas, finished arrows were rubbed with herbs or smoke before use, a kind of spiritual varnish sealing the maker's intent. The ceremony wasn't decoration, it was physics with ethics. The better the alignment between respect and precision, the truer the flight. Each detail, from how tightly sinew was wrapped to how the arrow was stored, was a meditation on balance between hunger and restraint, life and death, maker and made. And when all of that was complete, the hunter would finally hold the arrow to his chest, resting it against his heartbeat, a quiet transfer of energy before it left his body. After that, it wasn't entirely his anymore. The arrow had become something else, an envoy, a messenger between worlds, which was exactly what it would become once it was in flight, not merely a weapon, but a letter written in air, carrying both need and apology toward the waiting spirit of the animal. Once loosed from the bow, the arrow stopped belonging to the hunter. It entered a space between realms, part physics, part prayer. The San believed the arrow didn't kill an animal so much as speak to it, carrying a message of need and reverence. The Apache said the arrow told the truth of the heart. If the hunter's intent was clean, the animal's spirit recognized it and accepted the exchange. If not, the shot went wide, the wind itself correcting an unworthy aim. This is how the arrow became both tool and messenger. It was practical, yes, it pierced, it hunted, it fed, but its real duty was negotiation. The hunter's body might stay on earth, but the arrow crossed into the invisible, petitioning the animal's soul for permission to take flesh. Missed arrows were not failures. They were refusals. The spirits, they said, simply weren't convinced. Among the Inuit, each arrow was named often after an ancestor or an animal spirit. You didn't shoot blindly. You sent someone you trusted ahead of you. The plains hunters carried their arrows in bundles, each wrapped with sacred herbs and hidden symbols. Before the hunt, these were unwrapped with the solemnity of an unveiling. To touch an arrow without purpose was disrespect. To fire one in anger was blasphemy. There's a certain irony in how modern people treat weapons as sterile tools of precision, stripped of all emotion, while traditional hunters filled theirs with feeling. The arrow wasn't meant to deliver violence, it was meant to restore balance. Every kill had to justify itself cosmically. You could feel it in the way hunters moved, deliberate, patient, as if aware that the air itself was watching. The most devout believed that the arrow's path revealed the invisible order of things. Wind wasn't random, it was response. A sudden gust might redirect the shot, not by chance, but as guidance. Some even said that when an arrow curved unexpectedly and still struck its mark, it meant the animal had agreed to die. That's a complicated theology, but an elegant one. Morality aerodynamic in form. When the arrow returned, retrieved, cleaned, or even broken, it came back carrying something of the animal, a trace of life, a new vibration, a weight invisible to the hand but heavy to the spirit. You didn't throw it back in your quiver without ceremony. You acknowledged what it had done. Some burned a bit of sage over the tip, others hummed quietly. In that brief ritual, the arrow was released from what it had witnessed. This blurring between material and spiritual wasn't abstract philosophy. It was survival logic woven into cosmology. The hunter's world was alive, and the arrow was the only thing fast enough to move between its layers, air, flesh, and spirit. Every time it flew, it restated the oldest truth in existence, that nothing living moves alone. And if the arrow was the voice of the human heart, the feathers that guided it were its breath, the quiet whisper that carried prayer into the wind. Feathers were not chosen, they were invited. The hunter never plucked them casually. That would have been like stealing someone's voice mid-sentence. Instead, feathers were offered, often from birds already taken for food, or found dead by chance, their wings spread like open hands. In most traditions, the bird's permission mattered as much as the arrow's balance. You didn't just build flight, you borrowed it. Among plains hunters, eagle and hawk feathers were prized, not because they looked impressive, but because those birds flew the highest and saw the farthest. To use their feathers meant inheriting a sliver of their perspective. The Apache bound owl feathers for stealth, believing the bird's silent wings taught the arrow to move without warning. The sand preferred the delicate plumage of small desert birds. They said light feathers carried humble prayers. Each choice reflected personality, ethics, and geography. Fletching was done with near religious patience. Every feather was cut, aligned, and bound by hand. The quills tightened with sinew while soft chants kept rhythm. Some hunters sang to the wind as they worked, asking it to remember the arrow when the time came. The wind, in their stories, had a temper. It helped those who asked politely and punished those who didn't. So each arrow carried a fragment of that negotiation, a truce between human breath and the invisible currents of the sky. Feathers did more than stabilize flight. They spiritualized it. In the Arctic, hunters described arrows as songs made solid. The bowstring's release was the note, the arrow the melody, the feathers the harmony. In that single motion, draw, exhale, release, the body composed prayer without language. It's difficult to overstate how literal that was. Breath itself was sacred. Exhaling while releasing was a form of surrender, letting the air carry not only the arrow but one's intent. The hunter's lungs, the bird's wings, and the earth's wind became a single instrument, and the belief ran deeper. Each arrow was born twice, once in the hand that crafted it, and once again when it left the bow, catching the wind like a bird remembering how to fly. The moment of flight wasn't control, it was collaboration. Hunters said the arrow knew where to go, if the prayer inside it was clean enough. Modern archers talk about letting go, an echo of the same philosophy, stripped of its sacred vocabulary but still haunted by it. And when the arrow disappeared into the horizon, it wasn't the end of the act. The hunter remained frozen for a breath or two, hands still open, as if reluctant to break the invisible thread between himself and what he'd just sent out. In that small stillness was the acknowledgement that the arrow no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the wind now. But even flight had rules. A prayer could only travel cleanly if the mind behind it was steady. A trembling heart sent crooked arrows. A spiteful thought made them fall short. The arrow's accuracy, they believed, was simply morality measured in trajectory. And so, before any release, before sinew stretched and silence broke, the hunter had to confront the most dangerous variable in the ritual, his own intention. In the world of the old hunters, missing wasn't always about physics, it was about attitude. You could have the finest arrow ever made, straight shaft, perfect fletching, stone tip sharp enough to shame a thought, and it would still veer off course if your heart was crooked. The universe, as they understood it, had impeccable aim. It just didn't tolerate arrogance. Among the plains tribes, it was said that the arrow could sense pride. If a man boasted about his skill, the next shot would betray him, often spectacularly. The Apache believed that malice left a residue on the air, thick enough to drag an arrow sideways. The San in the Kalahari warned that laughing too loudly before a hunt invited mischief from the spirits of the grass, who could trip a shot for fun. Every failure was moral physics disguised as chance. The ethical rule was disarmingly simple. You could only take life cleanly if your mind was clean. Hunters fasted before the hunt, not to impress anyone, but to filter out the noise, the petty irritations, the jealousies, the small, sour things that cluttered precision. Hunger brought humility. By the time the bowstring was drawn, the hunter was as lean in spirit as in body. The act of aiming wasn't domination, it was alignment. The hunter wasn't imposing will on the world. He was finding the narrow seam where need, respect, and timing converged. The arrow, then, wasn't a command, it was a question asked beautifully, and the answer depended entirely on tone. In some Arctic traditions, before shooting a seal, a hunter whispered a compliment: "You are strong, and your skin will feed my family." The idea wasn't absurd politeness, it was reciprocity. You didn't want the seal's spirit to feel mocked. In parts of North America, hunters refused to hunt while angry because the arrow would carry the quarrel forward. Even the Aztecs, whose archery bordered on ceremony, believed each shot was judged not by gods but by conscience. The ethics of aim made hunting paradoxical, a violent act requiring gentleness. It's easy to imagine how much psychological discipline was demanded. To kill without hatred, to strike without excitement, to move without greed. These were moral acrobatics performed in silence. A good hunter's heart beat slowly, his mind quiet, his arrow obedient. But it wasn't just about virtue, it was practicality disguised as philosophy. Rage made your hands shake. Regret made you hesitate. The clean shot required composure, so pure it bordered on worship. And when everything, breath, thought, bowstring finally aligned, there came a hush so deep it felt like the world paused to listen. That hush marked the next stage, the moment that separated thought from motion, self from surrender. The breath you'd been holding turned into release, and that release became the prayer itself. There's a peculiar quiet right before an arrow leaves the bow, the kind that feels heavier than silence, like the air is waiting to be exhaled. Hunters treated that moment as sacred because it was the only one where intention, breath, and fate shared the same heartbeat. You could call it concentration, but that would undersell it. It was surrender disguised as precision. In nearly every culture that used a bow, breath governed the shot. The Apache said, "You must breathe the arrow into the world." The Japanese archers of Kido treated the exhale not as a physical act, but a purification, the moment where the human left the equation and only balance remained. Even among the San, where archery had no formal doctrine, hunters instinctively held their breath on the draw and released it with the shot, as though their lungs were part of the bowstring. The breath wasn't just timing, it was offering. Air carried life, voice, and spirit, so to breathe out while releasing was to send a fragment of yourself into the arrow's flight. You couldn't take it back, which is why hunters approached that exhale with care. Too quick, and you startled the world. Too slow, and the wind forgot you were serious. The goal was quiet cooperation. The lungs, the bow, the body, the universe, all exhaling together. Some tribes believed the arrow actually rode the breath. The shaft, they said, caught the invisible current and followed it like a leaf on water. Breath made the arrow weightless, as if carried by something larger than aim. The Inuit even had a phrase that meant to breathe the world straight, used when describing a flawless shot. The idea being that the air and the arrow had agreed on direction before release. There's a strange tenderness in that, killing through gentleness, guiding death with calm. The hunter's exhale wasn't aggression, it was confession. Whatever emotion he'd hidden up until that point, hunger, reverence, fear, all went into that one breath. That's what made the arrow holy. It wasn't just the materials or the rituals, but that moment where control gave way to trust. The archer's body ended, and the prayer began, and it worked both ways. A misfired arrow was sometimes described as a breath that wandered. The spirits, they said, had caught the wind mid-flight and sent it elsewhere. To modern ears, that sounds like a poetic excuse, but it's also a subtle recognition of humility. Even mastery has limits when the world is alive and responsive. Afterward, the hunter rarely moved right away. There was a stillness that followed, the kind that acknowledged something irreversible had just occurred. The arrow was gone. Its message was in transit. All you could do was wait for an answer, the thud of impact, or the long echo of refusal. And when the answer came, it was never joy. Relief, perhaps. Gratitude, always. Because the release, both breath and arrow, wasn't about power. It was about responsibility. And that responsibility didn't end with the shot. It began with what came next, the ritual of thanks, the recognition that no prayer should go unanswered without gratitude. The first sound after the kill was never triumph. It was apology. The hunter didn't shout or celebrate. He lowered his head, touched the earth, and spoke softly to the fallen animal. Gratitude came before blood. It wasn't sentimentality, it was etiquette. You had just taken something sacred. The least you could do was mind your manners. Among the plains hunters, a quiet word was whispered into the animal's ear. "Thank you for letting me eat." It sounds small, but it was an act of immense weight, a verbal handshake between life and death. The sand would smear a bit of the animal's blood on their arrows and foreheads, marking the bond between giver and taker. The Apache might burn a sprig of sage, or toss a pinch of tobacco into the wind, a bribe to the unseen forces who'd allowed success. Every gesture was a reminder that meat was not owed, it was granted. Some Arctic hunters left tools or beads beside the carcass as gifts. They believed the animal's spirit lingered nearby, watching to see how its body was treated. If disrespected, it might return in dreams, or worse, as misfortune on the next hunt. The Inuit even addressed seals directly, telling them how beautifully they'd lived, how necessary their death had been. Modern ears may hear ritual. Ancient ones heard responsibility. The arrow itself was part of this ceremony. Before being cleaned or reused, it was sometimes rested, placed on the ground beside the animal, or stood upright in the soil. Tipped down, as a way of bowing. Hunters said the arrow needed to breathe too, to release the spirit it had carried. You didn't simply reload it and walk away. A used arrow had seen too much to be treated like a tool. These rituals weren't quaint superstitions. They were the moral infrastructure of survival. Without them, hunting risked collapsing into violence. Every thank you, every whisper, every offering, they were ways of repairing what necessity had broken. In some tribes, if a hunter failed to perform the ritual, others would refuse to eat the meat, fearing it carried spiritual contamination, a kind of metaphysical guilt. The act of skinning and butchering was also deliberate. Nothing was rushed. The bones were laid carefully, sometimes aligned to point toward the rising sun, symbolizing the animal's continued journey. Even the leftovers, bones, sinew, scraps, were placed where scavengers could find them easily, a way of letting the world recycle the gift. To modern logic, such restraint might seem burdensome, but imagine a world where everything that feeds you must first forgive you. Gratitude was not decoration. It was survival etiquette written into the muscles. You didn't just eat to live, you lived to remain worthy of eating. And as the hunter carried the meat home, the ritual didn't end. The village would welcome him, not with cheers, but with quiet respect. The fire was lit, prayers muttered over boiling pots, children told to stay silent while the first bite was offered to the flames. Food, after all, was never truly consumed. It was shared between Bodhi's ancestors and the unseen. Yet, no matter how sacred the thanks, each arrow carried the weight of repetition, because the next hunt would come soon. And with it, the same question: could one continue to kill reverently, or did reverence fade after too many kills? That question haunted every true hunter, and the answer lived somewhere between fear and faith. No hunter ever truly escaped what he took. The animal fed the body, but the act left a mark on the spirit, a faint bruise that needed tending. Across the world, traditional hunters spoke of a lingering heaviness after a kill. It wasn't guilt in the modern sense, but awareness, a physical knowledge that life had been rearranged and you were now responsible for the imbalance. You had changed the arithmetic of existence. Among the Inuit, it was said that a careless or arrogant hunter would start to dream of the animals he'd slain, not as enemies, but as silent figures watching from the ice. The Apache spoke of the hunger that looks back, the sense that the world remembers every life taken, every prayer rushed. Plains hunters told of mysterious illnesses that followed those who mocked their prey. Fevers, bad luck, the loss of skill. There was no sharp line between ethics and survival. One protected the other. The San, those quiet masters of the desert, believed each hunt filled the body with a kind of heat, a dangerous energy that could heal or harm depending on how it was used. After a successful kill, that boiled inside the hunter, almost feverish. It needed to be cooled through ritual dancing, trance, or long silences by the fire. Without it, they said, a man could become wild, even mad. Killing was never routine. It was a form of spiritual intoxication that required detox. Even the tools carried echoes of the act. A bow might feel heavier after a kill, a certain stiffness in the string, a quiet demand to rest. Arrows were sometimes burned after taking life, not from superstition, but from respect. The energy they'd carried had completed its task. Reusing them without purification would mean carrying yesterday's death into tomorrow's breath. To outsiders, this might sound exhausting to treat every hunt as moral theater. But for these hunters, the world was alive in a way ours rarely is. The grass remembered footsteps. The wind judged tone. The animal's spirit was not gone, but redistributed in bone, smoke, and story. And you, the one who took it, now carried its memory in your blood. That was the true meaning of possession. You didn't own what you killed. You were inhabited by it. You took on its strength, yes, but also its duty. To waste meat was to insult its patience. To brag was to mock its gift. To forget it was to invite the kind of silence where no arrow would ever fly straight again. This belief shaped how entire communities behaved after a hunt. Songs were sung not about triumph, but about balance. Even the children were told, the deer did not die, it changed shape. Life wasn't a ladder. It was a circle that fed on humility. And somewhere inside that philosophy, inside the fear, the reverence, and the exhaustion was a strange kind of peace. Because the hunter who knew he could wound the world, and still bowed before it, understood something that most civilizations later forgot, that survival was not victory. It was permission, but permission had to be renewed each time. And for that, the hunter had only one language the spirits would still listen to: the arrow itself. Every arrow was a sermon disguised as flight. To call it a weapon was to miss the point entirely. It wasn't made to conquer but to communicate, a handmade sentence sent skyward in hopes that something listening above or below might answer. Hunters believed the gods were not impressed by temples or gold. They preferred sincerity in motion. A perfect arrow, balanced, humble, released without pride, was worth more than any chant. It was physical proof that a human being had managed, however briefly, to move in harmony with everything else alive. Across the Americas, hunters decorated their arrows, not for vanity but for dialogue. Feathers were painted with natural dyes: ochre, soot, berry pigment, each color holding a message. Red for courage, white for purity, black for guidance through darkness. The shaft might be carved with subtle markings, prayers in the form of spirals or sunlines. These weren't aesthetic flourishes. They were punctuation marks in a conversation older than speech. The San believed an arrow sang as it flew. You couldn't hear it, but the spirits could. The whistle of air across its feathers was said to carry your request for food, for mercy, for forgiveness. The Apache sometimes tied bits of fur or hair to the fletching, so that, mid-flight, the arrow remembered the animals it asked to join it. Even the Japanese ya arrow, used in Kaido ceremony, whistled deliberately. Its carved openings turned air into a flute, a direct offering to the divine ear. And yet, every prayer was double-pitched. The same motion that asked for life also took it. That paradox haunted the hunters, that devotion and death shared the same mechanics. You pulled back, exhaled, released, and in that single movement, you both worshipped and destroyed. Perhaps that's why humility was mandatory. To shoot without reverence was to commit blasphemy in the most literal sense, to speak falsely in the language of the wind. In some plains traditions, arrows were blessed in bundles, not to make them stronger, but quieter. The prayers inside them, hunters said, needed to be calm, unshaken by greed or fear. A trembling spirit sent noisy prayers, and noisy prayers were ignored. Before battle or hunt, men sat in silence, breathing over their arrows, letting stillness soak into the wood. There was no magic here, only mindfulness so refined it bordered on the divine. Even in death, arrows continued to pray. Some were left with the fallen animal, others broken ceremonially, releasing the breath they carried. A few were buried with their maker, meant to deliver one last message: I came in peace, even when I took life. It's easy to romanticize all this, to imagine noble archers whispering to their weapons like poets. But what's striking is how consistent this belief was across cultures. Whether in the desert, the tundra, or the jungle, people everywhere seemed to agree on one unsettling truth: that the straightest path between earth and heaven was made of wood, sinew, and silence. And in that silence, as the last arrow flew, hunters saw the shape of something larger, not just faith, but memory. 4 arrows did not vanish when they landed. They became the very stories that outlived their makers. Long after the hunter was gone, the arrow remained, buried in dust, lodged in bark, or displayed quietly in a museum that smelled of varnish and forgetting. Yet even stripped of its hand and ritual, it still hummed faintly with purpose. Anthropologists have found them everywhere: shafts blackened by time, fletching turned to dust, points chipped by stone or bone. Objects, yes, but also evidence of a conversation humanity once had with the living world, back when survival and reverence were the same language. Among the plains tribes, arrowheads were often left in sacred places after the hunt: riverbanks, hilltops, near herds, not as litter but as markers. Each one meant, we were here, we asked permission, and the world answered. Over centuries, those offerings formed quiet archives of gratitude. The San left broken arrows near watering holes, returning them to the earth as if tucking words back into a book. The Inuit placed their old arrows in cairns of stone, believing the wind that whistled through them carried the voices of the ancestors. An ongoing choir of breath turned to memory. Even the myths kept the echo alive. In Apache stories, the first arrow ever made was said to pierce not flesh but darkness, carving daylight into the world. In Egypt, Horus's arrows were rays of sunlight, each shot illuminating creation. In the Arctic, children were told that stars were old arrows fired by gods who never missed. Across continents, the same logic repeated. Flight was not destruction, but revelation. Modern people see arrowheads and think of warfare or hunting, but to their makers, those points were punctuation marks in a lifelong dialogue. Each one told a story of intention, of hunger balanced by humility, of the thin line between need and greed. The physical arrow was temporary. The discipline it represented was eternal. And perhaps that's why so many hunters, even as technology changed, refused to abandon the bow. Rifles were efficient. Arrows were moral. The bow demanded your presence, your breath, your steadiness, your listening. It didn't allow distance between you and consequence. You had to feel the air. You had to mean it. To hold a bow was to hold a reminder of fragility, both yours and the world's. When the arrow left your hand, it carried more than hunger. It carried the memory of every silence, every apology, every heartbeat that preceded it. The shot was never just about eating. It was about continuing the conversation that kept life stitched together. And maybe that's the haunting truth behind all of it, that prayer doesn't always rise from altars or mouths. Sometimes it's made of sinew, flint, and patience. Sometimes it whistles. Sometimes it lands. And sometimes it's simply found again centuries later by someone digging in the earth, holding the ghost of a flight that once asked, politely, beautifully, to live. That's where the story ends, not in death, but in repetition. Every arrow ever shot was an attempt to remember how to ask for life without taking too much of it. The prayer never stopped flying. It just changed hands.